sometimes when you do a wildlife photography, the lighting might not be as perfect as you'd like in order to catch a catch light in an animal's eye. What I mean by a catch light is that bright little sparkle in the eye that you typically see. But what's interesting is many times that bright catch light will not be a little circle. And I'm going to show you as I go in closer to these images what catch lights really look like and how to bring out the detail in those catch lights in Photoshop. So if the sun is really bright, you might get that white glint, but most of the time you're going to get a curvature of light and dark in the eye. And you'll want to bring that out in cases where the light might not be as perfect as you'd like in order to improve how your audience will actually perceive that image, because we connect with the eyes first in an animal when we're looking at photography. And so it's important not only to have that eye be tack sharp, but to also have it have some light to it. So you're looking at an image right now that is just a raw image. I haven't done a thing with it. It was in slightly overcast skies, but for the most part they were pretty bright. And it was late in the morning, so you have more top-down light, which is why you're not seeing much of a shadow down here, and you're getting a little bit of this darkness under the eye. It's still a workable photo. It may not be a level 10, but you can definitely increase the enjoyment of viewing this picture by playing a little bit with the light. And then of course I also have this branch going through the image, and I'll show you how to address that as well. First thing you want to do is go over to the right hand side and make a copy of this background image. To do so, you can simply click and drag and drop it into this area here, and it will make a duplicate copy. Next thing that we want to do is look at the shadows in the image. Now there's a variety of things that we can do to reduce some of those shadows, but one of my favorite things is to actually go back to Adobe Camera Raw, or you could do this in Lightroom, same type of tools. I'm going to use Adobe Camera Raw here. I'm going to go up to Filter, Camera Raw Filter. And this brings up some options, or in Lightroom you can do a similar technique where you can change the shadows and the brightness and so forth. I don't necessarily need to lighten the shadows everywhere, but if I look at this image, there's some pretty dark shadows here in the ears, in the eyes, and in the nose. Some of that is good, but if it goes to an almost pure black state, it can be a little bit ugly when you're looking at it. So what I like to do is click my paintbrush. And again, you can do similar techniques in Lightroom. And then you can reset any settings from a prior use of this by clicking this little area up here and clicking Reset Local Cameras, Reset Local Settings. And then you can paint an area. So I'm going to zoom in here. All right, so now I've got a nice close view of the nose and the eye of this bear. So I could take my paintbrush and adjust the exposure upwards a little bit and pull the shadows up and then start painting. And you'll see that wherever you paint, it'll take those areas and lighten the exposure. You don't want to do it too much. You don't want it to look fake. You just want to add in some light as if it were maybe more of an overcast day, so some of these areas would be a little more detailed. So if I don't like what I've done, I can always then go back to these sliders and adjust it upwards more. Okay, that's too bright, but you get the idea. Or I could pull it down if I wanted to darken it. And of course that's too dark as well. It looks like he just dipped his nose in paint. So I'm just going to pull it up until it looks right to me. And again, your computer monitor should be calibrated in a way where this will look appropriate for your audience, not just on your monitor. I can also pull up highlights if I wanted to make the nose a little bit brighter, or I can pull up those shadows even further to bring in more detail in that nose. All right, so I've done that much. Once I'm finished, I can click OK, or I can play with some of these other settings as well. But I can click OK, and then that in this layer here sets that particular setting. So this layer I can click, and then I can change it to lighten nose, let's say. Okay, so if you want to see the difference between the two, here's the before, here's the after. If you think it's too light, you can always go in to this layer, and this opacity can be dropped down until it's at a level that you like. So maybe around 66% is what you like for this. So now you can adjust that without having to go and redo it in Camera Raw or deleting this and starting over. All right, if you're happy with that, now what we can do is work on the eye. Now, we could work on the eye by going back to Camera Raw filter and doing some similar things. I'll zoom in again. We'll get a nice tight view on that eye for a minute. And of course it's going to look a little blurry because I've zoomed in at 230% at this point. But I want to show you a few details about this eye. So first of all, when you're looking at the eye, there's the catch light. Keep in mind, this is, late in the morning, so the light's pretty high above us. And then wherever the catch light is, on the opposite side, you'll typically see a lighter area of the iris. And that's important because we want to bring that back. A lot of amateurs that I've seen will go in with a white brush and put a little dot somewhere in the eye and call that a catch light. It never really looks quite right. And the reason is this eye is a curved sphere, and we want to make sure that we bring in these subtleties like they would normally occur if we had a little bit more light shining into the eye. We don't just want to put a white dot there somewhere. And even when you get a white dot from the reflection of the bright sun, you're still going to see a line where there's curvature at the horizon. So we need to bring that back. So one of the things that I can do is go in and I can play with my exposure settings again like I did before and lighten all this. That's too much, of course. I'm using the old settings. Or I can reset local correction settings and then do just what I need to do for this eye. So I can bring up some of this detail and just lighten it overall, but then we can play with it even more in Photoshop. So, all right, I've lightened this a little bit to bring in some more detail. And I'm going to click OK. And you can see the difference now in the eye. I've just lightened it a little bit. That's step one. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this layer button. And I'm going to create a new layer. And I'm going to call it the eye layer. You can call it whatever you want. And then I'm going to change it from normal to overlay. All right, overlay is important. If it was normal, we're just painting over it almost in an opaque way. Overlay allows a little more transparency. It's a little softer, more subtle. You can also play with some of the other ones like soft light or hard light and so forth, but I tend to like overlay. I'm going to go to my palette over here and I want to choose white. And if you've never used your palette before, when you click on these, it'll bring up a color picker. I always want to go to pure white or sometimes pure black, but there may be other reasons why you want to do different colors, and of course you can slide your slider up and down to create these different colors. All right, I'm still going to go to pure white and click OK for a moment. I'm going to go up to my paintbrush tool on the left, and there's all kinds of tools here. Make sure you're on the brush tool. And then up at the top, I'm going to change my hardness all the way down to 0. And of course, my size will be a lot smaller too. So here is the size of my brush now. I'm going to go in really tight on here, and I might even need to bring the size of my brush down more, and I can click my bracket buttons on the left or right hand bracket button and adjust that size even further. My opacity at this point is at about 10%. Sometimes you might only need to go as much as 5%, but I'll start with 10 and see what that looks like. So I'm going to go where these highlights are, and I'm just going to lightly click and go over them a couple of times to bring that up a little bit more. And then I'm going to go and bring up where it's reflecting outward on the bottom side of that eye. So I'm giving this a little more light and life, similar to what would happen if the light was a little bit better out in the field. And then I can go over other highlights if I want to bring them up a little bit more. Just kind of running your mouse over them a few times, click and drag type thing. I can even bring up some of the highlights in the eyelid and even some of these other characteristics in the pupil. We're not doing anything dramatic here. We're doing subtle techniques to just give it a little bit of a lift and bring out what's already there. I'm not painting in new eyeballs. I'm not doing anything dramatic. I'm using light and shade here to just essentially increase the contrast without using the contrast button, because this is something that is much more detailed and deliberate in these particular areas. We don't necessarily want all of it to be done. Similarly, if you have areas you want to darken, I can hit X, or I can go over to my palette again and choose the black color. And then I can go in and darken areas. Now there's not a whole lot I really want to darken here, but you can always add a little emphasis if you want in certain areas or around the pupil. I think this is pretty good on the dark side personally for me, but sometimes I will go and increase the contrast a little bit. We don't want it to look garish, and sometimes what looks okay blown up in this way, we zoom out and it kind of looks hideous. So you want to do a little bit and then take a look. So I'm going to go and zoom back out, and you can see how much more visible that eye is. If you want to see the before and after of the nose and the eye, simply click the layer off and click the layer on, and you'll see just how much difference there is. Keep in mind, I already did Adobe Camera Raw to lighten this up somewhat. If you want to see the completely raw image, there's the beginning, and there's the final result. So it brings in a little more life to this picture, and even though we zoom out, you'll be able to see the eye better and just enjoy that image a little bit more. So again, there's the original. See how much darker that nose and eye is. And then I did a little bit in Adobe Camera Raw, and we did a little bit more in Photoshop, and you get a nicer, brighter eye. All right, so now that that's finished, we can go and we can get rid of this stick here. One of the easiest ways you may find to try is to use your healing brush, set to content aware. And the healing brush, you can go in, and I recommend zooming in tight and bringing your brush in and just going over it lightly. Now sometimes you won't like the effect, and you can go back to clone. You can try it with the healing brush, and if you're not getting quite the look that you want, sometimes I go into my clone tool here, clone stamp tool. I select a similar area nearby, which means I hold my mouse button over and then I hit my Alt button. And then I can go in and clone these areas. And sometimes I have to select new content, right? I hold my mouse button over an area that looks similar to what I need to clone, and then I hold my Alt button and click, and then I can bring that in. You want to be really careful not to have a lot of duplicate fur where it's going to look like you've cloned it. You can't just have all these duplicated areas, so you really have to play with it so that it looks legitimate. All right, so I'm cloning that in, and I'm just picking different areas so it doesn't look like I'm sitting here and just duplicating the whole thing. Got to be really careful with it. All right, so I'm going to go in and do those things. I'm looking at this and realizing that this is set at opacity of 66%. So remember, when I took that nose down, it makes the layer 66% of normal. And that is why this background layer is showing through. So one of the things you can do to fix that is to go to Layer, Flatten, and then create a new duplicate layer, and you'll have more success. I just wanted to point that out because that can be a mistake or something of confusion for folks that haven't done this before. All right, so I'm fixing this. I could also try my clone brush again and see how that works. Sometimes it works great, sometimes not so much. You either have to go over it a couple times or go back to, I said healing brush, and then go back to clone brush as needed to get rid of this. But I like to work in a small area and do little bits at a time and make sure that you're using content that you're cloning that looks similar to what's already in the image. So when you get stuck, okay, there's things like this grass here. What do? I go in really tight. Take a very small brush and I copy along this border, right? So I'm going to clone that area. I'm going to hit Alt and then click my mouse. I'm going to clone that area, and through a series of very small clicks, I'm going to bring that up. And sometimes I've got to come from the top and bring it down so that I copy that margin. And then it's easier to fill in here and have it look like it's all part of the shadow that was there. All right, so we don't want to just get rid of it off the bear and then have this stick sticking out of nowhere. What you've started, you have to complete. So I can go in here clone this area and then make sure it matches up, right? Because if it doesn't match up, you're going to have green over here. So you've got to really follow that margin and then clone downward. Fix it where needed. You don't want a lot of things that look similar. So sometimes you got to grab from other content, make it look more realistic. Get rid of all that. Same thing with this blade of grass here. Yes, this is tedious. Yes, it takes time, but it's worth it in the end. One thing I want to mention is, I have no problem using Photoshop for whatever purposes you want, but you want to be thoughtful about what you're conveying to your viewers about what the image really was. And if you're using this image for photo contests, make sure that the contests allow for some adjustments like these, because certain contests, certain situations require completely unmodified images. So this image might be fine to clean up a little bit if you're going to use it in your home or give it to friends or, use as your art. I have no problem with that. But if, like I said, you're entering a contest of some kind, you've got to really be thoughtful. So you can still see some clone marks in here. So sometimes what I do is I take my opacity and I go down to maybe 30%. And I reclone over areas and just kind of fill in and smooth it out so it looks a little more natural. Again, you can play with that a little bit more, but that's the general idea. All right, so now we've gotten rid of that stick, and if you were wondering, there's the before, there's the after. Okay, so we've cleaned that up. The next thing that I'll do is I'll go in and I will clean up other little areas that are distracting. I always look for things that are bright white along the edges, and one of those things that I see is this thing here. So I can go to my healing brush and then just completely get rid of that. And that becomes less distracting on the edge. So again, there's the before, there's the after, and I'll zoom in closer. There's the before, there's the after. It just makes it a cleaner image. Even things like this up on the right hand side, a little bit distracting because your eyes always want to go to the lightest things in an image and then the darkest things. So if there are things that are distracting in your image, you want to check those and maybe get rid of those. Even this blade of grass over here is pretty bright. So if I got rid of that, it makes it a little bit easier for me to see and enjoy the subject, which is the bear. Okay, so now that we're that far, I can take it a little further. I've got a bright ear over here. Let's go back to Camera Raw. I'm going to go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and I'll show you another technique that you can use. And I'll show you two different ways that we can do it. So one technique would be to go and zoom in, grab my paintbrush, and again, I'm doing this in Camera Raw. You can do it in Lightroom as well. I take my highlights. I'm going to actually clear my correction settings. I'm going to take highlights down in this case. This is pretty bright, and we need some highlight there, but I can actually take down that highlight pretty naturally by painting over it and then making some adjustments here as needed to just tone it down a little bit. Why do I want to do that? Well, it's kind of bright and distracting, and this tones that down a little bit better. All right, so I click OK. And again, here is the before, and here's the after. And I'll zoom in with the ear again. There's the before, there's the after. So when I'm looking at this image, if I have all the befores, now this doesn't include the eyes and the things that we did, but there's the before with some of the treatment of color and removing distracting things. There's the after. If you really want to see the initial image, here's the before. That's the first one without touching anything. Here's after. Before, after. I feel like I'm at the eye doctor now, but you get the idea. One other thing you can try is to create another layer, make it an overlay layer, and then get your white and black out again. Put your opacity at maybe 5%. And then make your brush a little larger. It's got to be a very soft brush, so hardness at 0. And you can add your own very soft vignette. So this bright rock is also distracting to me. I can darken that up a little bit where needed and add a little bit of a vignette where I kind of enjoy having it. I can darken down some of that fur in the back. And again, I'm doing this quickly. I'll probably play with it a little bit more if I was doing this, legitimately. I might even consider getting rid of some of these shadows there, but take it or leave it. Depends on what you like. It's your image, your preference. And then I can go in and, like he's got a fly on his nose here, which I think is probably annoying to him, but kind of cool. But, those are the things that you could clone out if you needed to. And I say him, this is actually a Sal. But anyhow, there you go. So if I take this image, there's the after, and we look at the before, you can see there's quite a bit of difference here. So again, there's the after, there's the before. What did I do? A little bit of cloning and a little bit of work with just white and black on an overlay layer. Those two things can really make changes in your image for the better. I hope this has been helpful. Have a wonderful day.